Hello, my beautiful, wonderful people, and welcome to this next episode of Egil Saga. In the days of King Harald Fairhair of Norway, Alfred the Great reigned over England, the first of his kinsmen to be sole ruler there. His son Edward succeeded him on the throne. He was the father of Athelstan the Victorious, who fostered Hakon the Good. At this time, Athelstan succeeded his father on the throne. Edward had other sons, Athelstan's brothers. After Athelstan's succession, some of the noblemen who had lost their realms to his family started to make war upon him, seizing the opportunity to claim them back when a young king was in control. These were British, Scots, and Irish. But King Athelstan mustered an army and paid anyone who wanted to enter his service, English and foreigner alike. Thorolf and Egil sailed south past Saxony and Flanders, and heard that the King of England was in need of soldiers, and that there was hope of much booty there. They decided to go there with their men. In the autumn they set off and went to see King Athelstan. He welcomed them warmly and felt that their support would strengthen his forces greatly. In the course of their conversations, he invited them to stay with him, enter his service, and defend his country. It was agreed that they would become King Athelstan's men. England had been Christian for a long time when this happened. King Athelstan was a devout Christian and was called Athelstan the Faithful. The king asked Thorolf and Egil to take the sign of the cross, because that was a common custom then among both merchants and mercenaries who dealt with Christians. Anyone who had taken the sign of the cross could mix freely with both Christians and heathens, while keeping the faith that they pleased. Thorolf and Egil did so at the king's request, and both took the sign of the cross. 300 of their men entered the king's service. Olaf the Red was the king of Scotland. He was Scottish on his father's side and Danish on his mother's, a descendant of Ragnar Shaggy Breeches. He was a powerful man. The realm of Scotland was considered to be 1/3 the size of England. Northumbria was considered to be 1/5 of the English realm. It is the northernmost district next to Scotland in the east, and had belonged to Danish kings in times of old. The main town is York. Northumbria belonged to King Athelstan, and he had appointed 2 earls to rule it, named Alfgar and Godric. They stayed there to defend it against aggression by Scots and by Danes and Norwegians, who raided heavily and made a strong claim on the land, since the only people there of any standing were of Danish descent, on their father's or mother's side, and there are many of each. 2 brothers, called Hring and Adils, ruled Britain. They paid tribute to King Athelstan, and accordingly, when they went to battle with the king, they and their men were in the vanguard, with the king's standard-bearers. These brothers were great warriors, even though they were no longer young men. Alfred the Great had deprived all the tributary kings of their rank and power. Those who had been kings or princes before were now titled earls. This arrangement prevailed throughout his lifetime and that of his son Edward. But when Athelstan ascended to the throne at an early age, he was considered a less imposing figure, and many people who had once served the king became disloyal. King Olaf of Scotland gathered a great army and went south to England, and on reaching Northumbria he began plundering. When the earls who ruled there heard this, they mustered troops and went to face the king. A great battle ensued when they met, which ended in a victory for King Olaf, while Godric was killed and Alfgar fled, together with the majority of the troops that had accompanied them, and managed to escape from the fighting. Since Alfgar offered no resistance, King Olaf conquered the whole of Northumbria. Alfgar went to meet King Athelstan and told him of his misfortunes. Hearing that such a huge army had entered his land, Athelstan dispatched messengers at once, gathered forces, and sent word to the earls and other leaders. The king set off straight away with the troops he mustered and went to face the Scots. When word spread that King Olaf had won a battle and taken control of a large part of England, acquiring a much greater army than Athelstan, many powerful men joined him. Hring and Adils heard this when they had gathered a large force and joined his side, making an enormous army. When King Athelstan heard all of this, he met his chieftains and councillors to ask what the best course of action would be, and gave everyone a full account of what he had heard about the deeds of the Scottish king and his large band of men. They were unanimous that Earl Alfgar had done terribly and deserved to be stripped of his rank. A plan was decided whereby King Athelstan would go back to the south of England and move northwards across the whole country gathering troops, because they saw that it would be a slow process mustering forces on the scale they needed, unless the king himself were to lead the army. The king appointed Thorolf and Egil as leaders of the army that had rallied there. They were to be in charge of the forces that the Vikings had brought to the king. Alfgeir was still in control of his own troops. The king appointed other men to lead the other divisions as he saw fit. When Egil returned to his companions after the meeting, they asked him what news he had to report about the king of the Scots. He spoke a verse. Olaf turned one earl in flight in a sharp encounter, and felled another. I have heard this warrior is hard to face. Godric went far astray on his path through the battlefield. The scourge of the English subdues half of Alfgeir's realm. After that, they sent messengers to King Olaf, saying that King Athelstan challenged him to a battle and proposed Wen Heath by Wen Forest as a site. He wanted them to stop raiding his realm, and the victor of the battle should rule England. He proposed meeting in battle after 1 week, and that the first to arrive should wait 1 week for the other. It was a custom then that if a king had been challenged to a pitched battle, he incurred dishonor if he went on raiding before it had been fought. King Olaf responded by stopping his armies and ceasing his attacks until the appointed day for the battle. Then he moved his troops to Wen Heath. There is a fortress north of the heath where King Olaf stayed and kept the greater part of his army, because beyond it lay a large stretch of countryside which he considered well suited for transporting provisions for his army. He sent his men up to the heath, which had been appointed as the battlefield, to camp there and prepare themselves before the other army arrived. When they reached the place chosen for the battlefield, hazel rods had already been put up to mark where it would be fought. The site had to be chosen carefully, since it had to be level and big enough for large armies to gather. At the side of the battlefield there is a level moor with a river on one side and a large forest on the other. King Athelstan's men had set up camp over a very long range at the narrowest point between the forest and river. Their tents stretched all the way from the forest to the river, and they had made camp so as to leave every third tent empty, with only a few men in each of the others. When King Olaf's men arrived, Athelstan's troops had gathered at the front of the camp, preventing them from entering the area. Athelstan's troops said that their tents were so full of men that there was nowhere near enough room for them all. The tents were on such high ground that it was impossible for Olaf's men to see past them and tell whether they were closely pitched, so they assumed that this must be a great army. King Olaf's men pitched their tents north of the hazel rods that marked out the battlefield, on a fairly steep slope. Every day, moreover, Athelstan's men said their king was either on his way then or had reached the fortress south of the moor. Troops joined them day and night. Once the appointed time had passed, Athelstan's men sent messengers to King Olaf to tell him that their king was ready to do battle and had a great army with him, but that he wanted to avoid inflicting casualties on the scale that seemed likely. Instead, he told them to return to Scotland, offering to give them a shilling of silver for every plough and all his realm, as a pledge of friendship between them. King Olaf began preparing his army for battle when the messengers arrived and intended to set off. But when they had delivered their message, he called a halt for the day and discussed it with the leaders of his army. They were divided over what to do. Some were eager to accept the offer, claiming that it would earn them great renown to return after exacting such a payment from Athelstan. Others discouraged him, saying that Athelstan would offer much more the second time if they turned this gesture down. And this is what they decided to do. The messengers asked King Olaf for more time to meet King Athelstan again and find out if he was prepared to pay more to keep the peace. They asked for a day's leave to write home, another day to discuss the matter, and a third to come back, and the king agreed. The messengers went home and returned on a third day as had been settled, to tell King Olaf that King Athelstan was prepared to repeat his earlier offer with an extra payment to the troops of 1 shilling for every free-born man, a mark for every leader of 12 men or more, a mark of gold for every captain, and 5 marks of gold for every earl. Olaf had the offer put to his men, and once again some were against it, and others were eager to accept. In the end, the king pronounced that he would accept the offer on a condition that King Athelstan would give him Northumbria too, with all the dues and tributes that went with it. The messengers asked for another 3 days' leave, and also for some of Olaf's men to go with them to hear King Athelstan's reply about whether or not he would accept this option, saying that they expected he would let little or nothing stand in the way of achieving a settlement. King Olaf agreed, and sent his men to King Athelstan. The messengers rode together and met King Athelstan in the nearest fortress on the southern side of the moor. King Olaf's men delivered their message and offer of a settlement. Athelstan's men also told him the offer they had made to King Olaf, adding that wise men had advised them to delay the battle until King Athelstan arrived. King Athelstan made a quick decision on the matter, telling the messengers, "Send word from me to King Olaf that I want to give him leave to return to Scotland with his troops and repay all the money which he wrongly took in this country. Let us then declare peace between our countries and promise not to attack each other. In addition, King Olaf will swear allegiance to me and rule Scotland in my name as my tributary king. Go back and tell him the way things stand." That same evening, the messengers went back and reached King Olaf in the middle of the night. They woke him up and told him King Athelstan's reply at once. The king had his earls and other leaders called over, then had the messengers repeat the outcome of their mission and King Athelstan's reply. When they heard it, they were unanimous that the next step would be to prepare for battle. The messengers added that Athelstan had a huge army and had arrived in the fortress where they had been that same day. Then Earl Egil said, "What I told you is coming to pass, King. You will find the English are cunning. While we have spent so much time sitting around here waiting, they have mustered all their forces, but their king was nowhere around when we arrived here. They have been gathering a huge army since we put up camp here. My advice now is that I ride to battle with my brother this very night with our troops. There is a chance that they will not be on their guard now that they have heard their king is nearby with a great army. We will mount an attack on them, and when they flee, they will be routed and prove all the less courageous to fight us afterwards." The king considered this a fine plan. "We will make our army ready at daybreak and join you." After deciding on this plan of action, they called an end to their meeting. Earl Hring and his brother Adils prepared their army and set off southwards towards the moor the same night. At daybreak, Thorolf and Egil's guards saw the army approaching. Trumpets were sounded, and the troops were put on their armor, then formed into 2 columns. Earl Alfgar commanded one of the columns with the standard at its head. In the column were the troops he had taken with him, together with others who had joined them from the countryside. It was a much larger band than the one under Thorolf and Egil's command. Thorolf was equipped with a broad, thick shield and a tough helmet on his head, and was girded with a sword which he called Long, a fine and trusty weapon. He carried a thrusting spear in his hand. Its blade was 2 ells long and rectangular, tapering to a point at one end but thick at the other. The shaft measured only a hand's length below the long and thick socket which joined it to the blade, but it was exceptionally stout. There was an iron spike through the socket, and the shaft was completely clad with iron. Such spears were known as scrapers of mail. Egil was equipped like Thorolf, girded with a sword that he called Adder, and had received in Courland an outstanding weapon. Neither of them wore a coat of mail. They raised the standard, which Thorfinn the Strong carried. All their troops had Viking shields and other Viking weaponry, and all the Vikings who were in the army were in their column. Thorolf and his men gathered near the wood, while Alfgeir's went along the riverside. Realizing that they would not be able to take Thorolf by surprise, Earl Adils and his brother began to group into 2 columns as well, with 2 standards. Adils grouped his troops to face Earl Alfgar and Hring against the Vikings. Then battle began, and both sides marched forward bravely. Earl Adils pressed forward until Alfgeir yielded ground. Then they advanced all the more bravely, and it was not long before Alfgeir fled. What happened to him was that he rode away south along the moor with a band of men with him. He rode until he approached the fortress where the king was staying. Then Earl Alfgeir said, I do not want to go to the town. We were showered with abuse the last time we returned to the king after suffering defeat at King Olaf's hands, and King Athelstan will not think our qualities have improved on this expedition. I won't expect him to show me any honor." Then he set off for the south of England, and what happened on his journey was that he rode night and day until he and his men reached Earlsness in the west. He took a ship over the channel to France, where one side of his family came from, and he never returned to England. Adils pursued the fleeing troops a short way at first, then returned to the site of the battle and mounted an attack. Seeing this, Thorolf swung round to face the Earl and ordered his men to bring his banner there. "Keep on the alert and stay close together." "We will edge our way towards the forest," he said, "and use it to cover us from the rear so that they cannot attack us from all sides." They did so and skirted the forest. A tough battle ensued. Egil attacked Adils and they fought hard. Despite the considerable difference in numbers, more of Adil's men were killed. Then Thorolf began fighting so furiously that he threw his shield over his back, grabbed his spear with both hands, and charged forward, hacking and thrusting to either side. Men leapt out of the way all around, but he killed many of them. He cleared a path to Earl Hring's standard, and there was no holding him back. He killed Earl Hring's standard bearer and chopped down the pole. Then he drove the spear through the Earl's coat of mail into his chest and through his body so that it came out between his shoulder blades, lifted him up on it above his own head, and thrust the end into the ground. Everyone saw how the Earl died on the spear, both his own men and his enemies. Then Thorolf drew his sword and hacked to either side, and his men attacked. Many British and Scots were killed then, and others turned and fled. When Earl Adil saw his brother dead, the heavy casualties in his ranks, and the men who were fleeing, he realized that the cause was lost. He turned to flee as well and ran for the forest, where he hid with his band. All the troops who had been with them fled too. They sustained heavy casualties, and they scattered far and wide across the moor. Earl Adils had thrown down his standard, and no one could tell whether it was he who was fleeing or someone else. Night soon began to fall, and Thorolf and Egil returned to their camp just as King Athelstan arrived with all his army, and they put up their tents and settled down. Shortly afterwards, King Olaf appeared with his army. They put up their tents and settled for the night where their men had already made camp. King Olaf was told that both his earls, Hring and Adils, had been killed, along with many other men. King Athelstan had settled for the night in the fortress mentioned earlier, where he had heard about the battle on the moor. He and his whole army made ready at once and went north along the moor, where they heard clear accounts of the outcome of the battle. Thorolf and Egil went to meet the king, and he thanked them for their courage and the victory they had won, pledging them his total friendship. They remained there together for the night. King Athelstan woke his men early the next morning. He spoke to his leaders and described how his troops were to be arranged. He ordered his band to lead the way, spearheaded by the finest fighters, and put Egil in charge of it. Thorolf will stay with his men and some others that I will place there, he said. This will be our second column, and he will be in charge of it, because the Scots tend to break ranks, run back and forth, and appear in different places. They often prove dangerous if you do not keep on the alert, but retreat if you confront them. Egil answered the king, I do not want to be separated from Thorolf in battle, but I think we should be assigned where we are needed for the most, and the fighting is the heaviest. Thorolf said, Let the king decide where he wants to assign us. We will support him as he wishes. I can take the place you have been assigned if you want. Egil said, You can decide, but this is an arrangement I will live to regret. The men formed columns as the king had ordered and raised the standards. The king's column stood on the plain and faced towards the river, and Thorolf skirted the forest above it. King Olaf saw that Athelstan had arranged his troops, and he began doing the same. He formed 2 columns as well, and moved his standard and the column that he commanded to face King Athelstan and his men. Both armies were so big that it was impossible to tell which was the larger. King Olaf's other column moved closer to the forest to face the men who were under Thorolf's command. It was led by Scottish earls and was very large, mostly consisting of Scots. Then the troops clashed, and a great battle soon ensued. Thorolf advanced bravely and had his standard carried along the side of the forest, intending to approach the king's men from their vulnerable side. He and his men were holding their shields in front of them, using the forest as cover to their right. Thorolf advanced so far that few of his men were in front of him, and when he was least expecting it, Earl Adils and his men ran out of the forest. Thorolf was stabbed with many spears at once and died there beside the forest. Thorfinn, his standard-bearer, retreated to where the troops were closer together, but Adils attacked them and a mighty battle ensued. The Scots let out a cry of victory when they had felled the leader. When Egil heard their cry and saw Thorolf's standard being withdrawn, he sensed that Thorolf could not be following it. He then ran out between the columns, and as soon as he met his men, he found out what had happened. He urged them to show great courage and led the way. Holding his sword Adder, he advanced bravely and chopped to either side and killed many men. Thorfinn carried the standard directly behind Egil, and the rest of the men followed it. A fierce battle took place, and Egil fought on until he came to Earl Adils. They exchanged a few blows before Adils was killed, and many men around him too. And when he died, the troops he had led fled the field. Egil and his men pursued them, killing everyone they could catch, and it was pointless for anyone to ask for his life to be spared. The Scottish earls did not remain very long when they saw their companions fleeing and ran away themselves. Egil and his men, headed for the king's column, came upon them from their vulnerable side and soon inflicted heavy casualties. The formation broke up and disintegrated. Many of Olaf's men fled, and the Vikings let out a cry of victory. When King Athelstan sensed that King Olaf's column was giving way, he urged his own men forward and had a standard brought forward, launching such a fierce assault that they broke ranks and suffered heavy losses. King Olaf was killed there, along with the majority of his men, because all those who fled were killed if they were caught. King Athelstan won a great victory then. King Athelstan left the scene of the battle, and his men pursued those who had fled. He rode back to the fortress without stopping for the night until he reached it, when Egil pursued the fleeing troops for a long time, killing every one of them that he caught. Then he returned to the scene of the battle with his band of men and found his dead brother Thorolf. He picked up his body and washed it, then dressed the corpse according to custom. They dug a grave there and buried Thorolf in it with his full weaponry and armor. Egil clasped a gold ring onto each of his arms before he left him. Then they piled rocks over the grave and sprinkled it with earth. Then Egil spoke this verse. The slayer of the Earl unfearing ventured bravely forth in the thunder god's din. Bold-hearted Thorolf fell. The ground will grow over my greatest brother near when. Deep as my sorrow is, I must keep it to myself. And he spoke another verse. I piled body mounds west of where the poles marked the battlefield. With black adder I smote Adils in a heavy shower of blows. The young Olaf made thunder of steel with the English. Ring entered the weapon fray, and the ravens did not starve. Then Egil went with his band of men to see King Athelstan, and approached him where he was sitting and drinking. There is much revelry, and when the king saw Egil arrive, he gave an order to clear the lower bench for his men, and told Egil to sit in the high seat there facing him. Egil sat down and put his shield at his feet. He was wearing a helmet and laid his sword across his knees, and now and again he would draw it halfway out of the scabbard, then thrust it back in. He sat upright, but with his head bowed low. Egil had very distinctive features, with a wide forehead, bushy brows, and a nose that was not long but extremely broad. His upper jaw was broad and long, and his chin and jawbones were exceptionally wide. With his thick neck and stout shoulders, he stood out from other men. When he was angry, his face grew harsh and fierce. He was well built and taller than other men, with thick wolf-grey hair, although he had gone bald at an early age. When he was sitting in this particular scene, he wrinkled one eyebrow right down to his cheek and raised the other up to the roots of his hair. Egil had dark eyes and was swarthy. He refused to drink even when served, but just raised and lowered his eyebrows in turn. King Athelstan was sitting in the high seat with a sword laid across his knees too, and after they had been sitting there like that for a while, the king unsheathed his sword, took a fine large ring from his arm, and slipped it over the point of the sword, then stood up and walked across the floor and handed it over the fire to Egil. Egil stood up, drew his sword, and walked out onto the floor. He put his sword through the ring and pulled it towards him, then went back to his place. The king sat down in his high seat. When Egil sat down, he drew the ring onto his arm, and his brow went back to normal. He put down his sword and helmet and took the drinking horn that was served to him, finished it, and spoke a verse. The god of the armor hangs, a jangling snare upon my clutch. The gibbet of hunting birds, the stamping ground of hawks. I raise the ring, the clasp that is worn, on the shield-splitting arm. On to my rod of the battle storm and praise of the feeder of ravens. From then onwards, Egil drank his full share and spoke to the others. Afterwards, the king had 2 chests brought in, carried by 2 men each. They were both full of silver. The king said, "These chests are yours, Egil, and if you go to Iceland, you will present this money to your father, which I am sending him as compensation for the death of his son. Share some of the money with Thorolf's kinsmen, those you regard as the best. Take compensation for your brother from me here, land or wealth, whichever you prefer, and if you wish to stay with me for longer, I will grant you any honor and respect that you care to name yourself." Egil accepted the money and thanked the king for his gift and friendship. From then on he began to cheer up and spoke a verse. For sorrow my beetling brows drooped over my eyelids. Now I have found one who smoothed the wrinkles on my forehead. The king has pushed the cliffs that gird my mask's ground back above my eyes. He grants bracelets no quarter. Afterwards, the men who thought likely to survive had their wounds dressed. Egil remained with King Athelstan for the winter after Thorolf's death, and had great respect from him. All the men who had been with the brothers had survived the battle stayed with him. Egil composed a drapa in praise of the king, which includes the following verse. The wager of battle who towers over the land, the royal progeny, has felled 3 kings. The realm passes to the king of Ela. Athelstan did other feats. The highborn king subdues all. This I swear, dispenser of golden wave fire. This is the refrain in the drapa. Even the highland deer's path belonged to mighty Athelstan now. As a reward for his poetry, Athelstan gave Egil 2 more gold rings, weighing a mark each, along with an expensive cloak that the king himself had worn. When spring came, Egil announced to the king that he intended to leave for Norway that summer and find out about the situation of Asgard, who was my brother Thorolf's wife. They have amassed plenty of wealth, but I do not know whether any of their children are still alive. I must provide for them if they are alive, but shall inherit everything if Thorolf has died childless. The king said, "Well, it is your decision, of course, to leave here if you feel you have duties to attend to, Egil. I would prefer you to do otherwise. Stay here permanently and accept anything you care to name." Egil thanked the king for his offer. "But I must leave immediately," he said, "as is my duty. But I am more likely than not to return to collect what you have promised me when I can arrange it." The king invited him to do so. Then Egil made ready to leave with his men, although many remained behind with the king. Egil had a great longship with 100 men or more on board, and when he was ready to set off and a fair wind got up, he put out to sea. He and King Athelstan parted in great friendship. He asked Egil to come back as quickly as he possibly could, and Egil said he would do so. Then Egil headed for Norway, and when he reached land he sailed straight to Fjords. He was told that Thordir the Hersir had died, and that his son Arnbjorn had succeeded to his titles to become one of the king's men. Egil went to meet Arnbjorn and was well received by him. Arnbjorn invited him to stay there, and Egil accepted the offer. He had a ship pulled up on the beach, and his men were given places to stay. Arnbjorn took Egil and 11 other men into his house, and he spent the winter with him. Ade.